Morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bill Messina with the University of Florida, and I appreciate the opportunity to present this webinar this morning. We monitor a lot of the issues with respect to U.S.-Cuban agricultural trade, but I want to take a little different perspective this morning and talk about the structure and function of Cuba's agriculture a little bit, some of the current issues and resulting trade patterns, because I think that helps give us a little fuller indication of what's going on there. And I want to start by making the observation that we are analysts and observers. We don't recommend lifting the embargo. We don't recommend tightening the embargo. We're just trying to make sure that anybody that needs information on Cuban agriculture, we can help provide the most current available data, information, and analysis. One of the very frequent responses you get when you ask questions about how things work in Cuba is muy complicado. Cuba is a complicated place. It's a centrally planned command and control economy that results in what we would consider to be some strange policies and strange outcomes, since we're used to working in a market economy. The Cuban government introduces market forces and then they pull them back, and then they introduce other market forces and pull them back, and it's so there's a constant evolution going on, and even though we've been working in Cuba for 22 years, we're still learning because the situation is constantly changing. In my presentation this morning, I want to take kind of an economist perspective. I want to go back to a basic economic concept of factors of production, talk about land, labor, and capital in the Cuban context. But I also want to talk about another factor of production that's not in the traditional economic literature this way, but entrepreneurship. I think it's going to play a very important role in the transition that's going to be gradually taking place in Cuba. When you talk about land area, if you haven't looked on a map, Cuba is not just another one of the small Caribbean islands. It's about the size of Virginia, and it's very nearly as large as all of the rest of the Caribbean islands added together. So it's a larger landmass than a lot of people think about typically. If you've been to the Bahamas and you've seen the very poor coral soils, or you've been to some of the other Caribbean islands that are basically just a mountain sticking out of the ocean, forget those images too, because Cuba has about 70% of its land area is arable. They've got good soils. They do have some water issues, since it's a long skinny island. They don't have a lot of surface water, and they run into problems if they pump too much groundwater in coastal areas, because they can get saltwater intrusion. They do not have freezes, but they do have hurricane risks, and that's certainly an issue and a challenge that they face, as we do here in Florida. If we move on to look at labor, Cuba has a very impressive universal education system. In fact, the CIA World Factbook reports that Cuba actually has a higher literacy rate than the United States. Not significantly higher, but I think it's still an indication of the comprehensiveness of the education system in Cuba. Cuba also has very well-trained scientists, and that's an important issue. Sometimes we don't think about that. There had been some labor shortages in agriculture. It's not uncommon in developing countries, or developed countries even, for people to want to move from the rural countryside into the cities. There's a perception among young people that it's going to be a more exciting lifestyle, might get a better job. But what's happening is agriculture in Cuba is very lucrative, and that's actually drawing labor gradually back out to the rural farm areas, and I think that's a very important development. So Cuba has a very long and rich agricultural tradition, and it's apparent as you're flying into Cuba when you see the fields lined out below you. Given all of that, you would expect Cuba to be an agricultural powerhouse. They were at one time. They are no longer. In 2008, in fact, the Cuban government reported that they are having to import over 80% of their total food supply. Now, our colleagues at the University of Havana suggest that they think the number is closer to 60%, but whether it's 60 or 80%, for a country with Cuba's agricultural potential, that's a huge proportion, huge reliance on imported food. So there's two questions that arise. How did they get to this point, and can Cuban agriculture recover? I want to look for a moment at factors contributing to Cuba's reliance on food imports, and the primary factor is, for the better part of the last 200 years, there has been a historically heavy emphasis on sugar production in Cuba, and that's because somebody was always willing to pay them, until recently, very willing to pay them high prices for their sugar. So it was a rational economic decision, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There's also the fundamental inefficiencies of central planning that we've seen in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, you see in Cuba. Until recently, there was a real unwillingness on the part of the revolutionary government to allow market forces to work. Now the government is trying to introduce market forces, and their ability to do so has been constrained. A good example, I was in Cuba last year, one of my trips last year, was talking with an economist from the Ministry of Agriculture, and we were talking about this issue, and he said, Bill, you have to understand, we've been telling people what to do for 50 years, and it's a hard habit to break. And I think that gets right to the crux of the matter. You've got mid-level bureaucrats that are reluctant to give up the control that they've had over all these years. Finally, there's a real lack of capital to invest for investment, and I want to talk about capital as that third factor of production. The Cuban economy, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has just simply not been able to generate domestic capital for investment. And even their lending channels and systems within the country, particularly to get lending out to agriculture, is pretty limited. So the Cuban government officials recognize the need for foreign investment, and they actually say that they need $2 billion per year in foreign investment to reach their goals for GDP growth. That is a huge number when you consider that Cuba's foreign investment laws are evolving, but they're not really up to international standards yet. So that's a very lofty goal, and one I'm not sure they're going to be able to hit. There have been some successes with foreign investments in Cuba, as long as firms are willing to operate in a joint venture with the Cuban government as the majority partner. The most successful areas have certainly been in tourist hotels. The Meliá hotel chain out of Spain has some very successful joint venture hotel properties down there. In fact, when President Obama was in Cuba last week, I'm sure he stayed at one of the Meliá hotels. Cuba has some of the largest nickel reserves in the world, and a Canadian company by the name of Sherritt International got involved in joint ventures in in nickel production in Cuba, and those have been successful. And there have been some foreign investments in agriculture, but almost all of them had been limited to export crops because of very limited effective domestic demand. And effective domestic demand is measured in terms of the ability to pay. Salaries at about $25 a month in Cuba, that doesn't give them an awful lot of purchasing power. So investments that went into the citrus industry, and they were substantial, were for export of fresh citrus fruit to Western Europe, and juice products as well, fresh and processed juice products. Citrus greening has hit Cuba. It's devastating us here in Florida, and it's even worse in Cuba because they don't have any resources to combat it. So there's some question as to the real future viability of Cuba's citrus industry. There's been a fair amount of investment in shellfish, lobster, and shrimp production and processing, again, mostly for export to Western Europe and Asia. Foreign investment has allowed Cuban rum to be shipped all over the world except to the United States. Same with Cuban cigars. Foreign joint investment has Cuban cigars going all over the world except to the U.S. There's a greenhouse vegetable operation that was started by the Canadian firm involved in nickel mining. The goal there was to produce vegetables to sell to the tourist hotels, but for reasons that have not been made clear, either publicly or privately, that operation, we understand, was closed down, was not successful. Now, there has been some recent successful foreign investment in Cuba's sugar industry. I want to talk about that a little bit. At the end of the late 1980s, 1989-90, Cuba was producing close to 8.5 million tons of sugar a year. That made them the third largest sugar producer in the world, behind Brazil and India. But Brazil and India both consume most of the sugar they produce domestically. So Cuba was actually the largest sugar exporter in the world at that time. And then you can see how their production in sugar completely collapsed. Only about 1.1 million tons in 2010-11. That was the worst harvest in more than a century for Cuba. In October of 2011, we had the opportunity on one of our trips to Cuba to go out to a sugar plantation, and we saw brand new, state-of-the-art Brazilian harvesting machines, center pivot irrigation systems, field equipment, and Brazil also was investing in refurbishing a Cuban sugar mill and managing its operation. And in 4 seasons, Cuba's sugar production increased to 1.8 million tons. That's more than a 60% increase in 4 seasons, which is quite substantial. Granted, it's not anywhere close to what they were producing in the late 1980s, but still it's a notable increase, and it was the result of Brazilian investment, which demonstrates an important lesson. Sugar is the only agricultural commodity sector in Cuba that's really experiencing any significant growth, and it's because of Brazilian investment. And this clearly demonstrates how important foreign investment can be to dramatically changing and improving Cuba's agricultural output. It would be expected that this could be replicated for other crops. Which crops it might be, crops might be invested in remains to be seen, but it's a very, very important lesson, I think, for Cuba's agricultural future. I want to talk basically or very quickly about Cuba's food system in the late 1980s. It was a very costly system for the Cuban government, but it was a stable system. All Cuban farms have quotas that they have to sell to the Cuban government. The Cuban government took those domestic production volumes and combined them with imported food purchases that were made based on subsidies from the Soviet Union, and they distributed these domestic and imported food supplies through a subsidized food ration system. It was expensive. It was estimated that it probably cost the Cuban government somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion a year, but it provided food to the people at very, very low prices. The problems begin with the collapse, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union about 18 months later, and that means over about a 1.5-year period, Cuba's subsidies from the Soviet Union, which were estimated to have been perhaps as high as $6 or maybe even $8 billion a year, disappeared all of a sudden. Cuba's economy collapsed. The agricultural sector in Cuba at that time was highly mechanized, very input intensive, and they couldn't get the inputs or the spare parts or the fuel to run the tractors, so agriculture was hit especially hard, and food shortages developed, both because domestic production declined and the ability to import was reduced. So the ration stores, people have a ration book that they were supposed to be able to take to a store and get rice and beans and basic staples to feed their family, and what happened in the early 1990s, they would go to the ration stores and the shelves were bare. Food shortages developed, and as the food shortages got worse, the black market for food grew. Black market transactions were only made in hard currency, not in Cuban pesos. So Cuban people that didn't have access to hard currency, either from remittances from family overseas or from tips in the tourist sector, weren't able to access these black market food supplies. That led to really a split in society, which in turn led to civil unrest that drove an important government policy change, one of several, but a particularly important one. In 1994, the government opened agricultural markets where farmers were able to sell production beyond their government quota, but all transactions had to take place in Cuban pesos. This made food more readily available for people that didn't have hard currency, and our economist colleagues at the University of Havana said it was an effort to bleach the black market. That's a term they used, which I thought was particularly appropriate. And these are photographs from Cuba's agricultural markets, which is an example of the entrepreneurial talent and energy in Cuba. Contrast this to the photographs that you saw of the bare shelves in the quota stores. You have really quite amazing variety of supplies. You have surprisingly good quality, given that they have no pesticides or insecticides to use. Market prices fluctuate sometimes by the hour, certainly by the day in these markets, depending on supply and demand. So these are very, very important sources of entrepreneurial activity and market forces. Cubans understand markets and supply and demand and incentives, and that's going to be a very important positive thing for future transitions in the Cuban economy. But if you look at Cuba's non-sugar agricultural production, it's really been pretty stagnant. It showed some improvements up to about 2004, and then it fell, and it's been more or less steady and stagnant since then, even though the government has introduced a whole series of other policy changes. So the bottom line is the heavy reliance on imports is still there. The current issues, I was just in Cuba about 3 weeks ago, and tourist travel and travel from the United States to Cuba has absolutely exploded over the last 15 months. It's easier for Americans to get down there now, and Europeans want to get there before the American influence overwhelms things, they say. What this has done is driven Cuba's infrastructure, or stretched Cuba's infrastructure for tourist trade at least to, if not beyond, capacity, and it's amazing. It's almost impossible to get hotel rooms. Airbnb is Cuba is their fastest growing market, renting rooms in people's homes. But what this has done within the food system, the demand for food in tourist hotels and in the very rapidly expanding network of private restaurants is increasing so quickly that it's driving increases in food costs for the Cuban citizens. To combat that, the Cuban Council of Ministers met in December to discuss this problem, and they introduced yet another food outlet, subsidized food outlet into the already complex food system. But again, the bottom line is the heavy reliance on imported food continues for Cuba. So one of the questions that I asked earlier, can Cuban agriculture recover? I think yes, absolutely. When will it recover? The answer to this question depends a great deal on foreign investment. The lack of access to the U.S. market is going to constrain investment. Ultimately, I think those who are interested in investing in Cuban agriculture are going to be looking with an eye towards exporting to the United States. If and when investment does come, it could potentially affect U.S. sales. At one point, U.S. rice growers were shipping a lot of rice to Cuba. Cuba has since shifted its purchases away from the United States toward Vietnam and Thailand because they're getting very large lines of credit and extended terms, sometimes as much as 12 or even 24 months. If investment goes into Cuba's rice industry and their rice production increases, their demand for imported rice is going to decrease. So that could have some impacts on potential U.S. exports. In the meantime, U.S. sales, as you heard in the first presentation, you hear in the third, are going to be constrained by the cash sale requirements of U.S. regulations. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. This is my contact information. If you have questions or would like to discuss any of these issues, I'd be happy to follow up with you. Thank you very much.